The sun was setting over the dusty arena, spilling a red glow onto a circle of wealthy men who leaned forward in their velvet seats. Their faces lit with cruel delight as they whispered bets and laughed among themselves. While in the center stood Rosa, a skinny 19-year-old girl, whose trembling hands clutched the edge of her faded dress as though it could shield her from the icy wind cutting through the stands. Her dark eyes wide with terror, flicking between the faces in the crowd and the locked gate across the ring where something heavy thudded against metal, sending tremors into her chest, her mind racing with panic as she remembered how these men had lured her here with promises to erase her family's crushing debts, only to force her into this barbaric spectacle. Knowing she couldn't refuse without putting her mother and sick little brother in danger, the smell of sweat, dust, and fear heavy around her, her lips dry as parchment, her body rigid as if bracing for a blow, and her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the crowd chanting her name like a twisted prayer. You wouldn't believe how this story ends, a turn of fate. So powerful it might melt even the hardest hearts and bring tears to eyes that thought they'd forgotten how to cry. Metal screamed as the gate flew open, and a wild stallion exploded into the ring, its coat gleaming like liquid bronze under the harsh floodlights, muscles rippling beneath its sleek hide as it skidded across the dirt, nostrils flaring wide, eyes rolling white with panic, while Rosa froze in place, unable to move as the beast tossed its mane and screamed a sound so raw it sliced through the roar of the crowd. Dust swirling around its pounding hooves like smoke, the men's voices rising into a frenzied chorus of cheers and gears, eager for blood, and Rosa felt a chill crawl up her spine as the horse lunged sideways, nearly colliding with the wooden rails, sending splinters flying, its breath steaming in the cold air. And in that instant, she realized this animal was not just angry, it was terrified, trapped like her, with nowhere to run. The stallion circled the ring, snorting and stamping, ears pinned flat against its skull as if expecting a blow, the whites of its eyes glinting like shards of glass under the lights. While Rosa tried to swallow, but her throat was so tight it felt like it might close entirely, the men shouting louder, waving fistfuls of cash, urging the animal to charge. As one man in a fur coat yelled that she'd be trampled if she didn't show the beast who was boss, the stallion's tail lashed side to side, flinging bits of dirt into the first rows, and Rosa saw the creature's sides heaving, each breath shallow and frantic, veins bulging like ropes along its neck, sweat shining along its flanks, and in a flash, she understood that its fear mirrored her own. Two creatures thrown together in a nightmare, neither had chosen. Her heart, splintering at the thought, and she suddenly couldn't bear to be just another piece of the show. Somewhere in the crowd, a drunken man shouted for her to hit the horse, claiming it would teach the beast respect, while others pounded the railings in savage rhythm, demanding a fight. Yet Rosa stayed rooted, her eyes locked on the stallion's trembling frame, noticing how its chest shuddered with every breath, its ribs showing like the slats of an old fence, its nostrils flaring wider as it turned a circle, tossing its head as though trying to find an escape, and she felt an ache so deep it nearly stole her breath, a connection sparking between their shared terror. While the men's laughter rose, echoing off the wooden beams, sounding almost inhuman in its hunger for violence. The smell of dust and sweat stinging her nose, her pulse racing. And, as the stallion's eyes finally met hers, wide and frantic, Rosa realized that no one else in that arena saw what she saw, that this creature wasn't a monster, but another prisoner desperate to survive. Rosa felt her breath hitch as the stallion's hooves skidded in the dirt, sending a spray of dust against her legs. The animal trembling so violently that flecks of foam flew from its mouth, its eyes darting around the ring like a cornered fugitive, and for a moment she saw herself in the beast. Both of them shackled by invisible chains, forced into a brutal spectacle neither wanted. As the men's shouts grew louder, egging her on, screaming for blood, and one man bellowed that she'd better make it worth the price of admission, while others waved cash in the air as though they could buy the horse's spirit. And Rosa tasted fear so sharp it felt like biting down on metal, the air around her charged with violence. While memories of her brother's coughing fits at home reminded her of why she'd agreed to come here. And yet, each second with the stallion convinced her that the price these men demanded was far too high for any soul to pay, because the animal was no savage, it was only terrified. and she wondered if she'd ever be able to live with herself if she became part of its torment. The stallion pawed the ground, its enormous shoulders rippling beneath its sleek hide, each movement betraying the exhaustion racking its body. Nostrils flaring so wide, Rosa could see the trembling pink flesh inside, the ragged lines of dried sweat crusting its flanks in foamy streaks, and every few seconds it tossed its head so violently that its mane lashed its eyes, while blood speckled the corners of its mouth where the bit had rubbed raw, the whites of its eyes flashing with frantic light. And Rosa found herself stepping closer, drawn by something deeper than fear, as if some invisible thread pulled her toward the creature. While the men's yells blurred into a wall of noise behind her, and the stallion shivered all over, flinching at each flicker of shadow, like it expected pain, as Rosa's chest tightened until she thought she might faint. And she realized with a jolt that this animal wasn't just fighting for its life, it was pleading for mercy. A man in a suit lunged forward, gripping the railing and snarling that if she didn't get control of the beast, he'd send in handlers with whips, while another man shouted that the girl was useless and they should throw her family onto the street instead. And Rosa felt her stomach churn as the threat of violence expanded beyond the ring, spilling into her future, her family's survival hanging on the invisible thread of the stallion's next move, while dust billowed higher around them, turning the ring into a suffocating haze, and the horse wheeled around so suddenly that its flanks slammed the wooden rails, rattling the entire structure, the audience gasping at the raw force of the animal. And Rosa flinched as chips of wood flew past her cheek, the sting making her eyes water, while deep inside her, something rebelled against the idea that her worth or the horse's was measured by how entertaining their suffering could be. And she felt a dangerous courage start to kindle in her chest, small but burning. In that split second, Rosa realized she couldn't keep pretending this was only about survival, because to let this animal be beaten or forced into rage for men's amusement was to betray every part of herself that still believed in kindness. And even though her legs felt like water, she took another cautious step forward. Ignoring the boos and curses from the crowd, her hands raised slightly, palms open, her voice trembling as she whispered soothing words that barely rose above the wind, while the stallion's ears flicked toward her, its sides still heaving, and for the first time it stopped circling and simply stared at her with those wide, liquid eyes, as though trying to decide if she was friend or threat. And in that instant Rosa made her choice, certain she'd have to pay a heavy price for it, because she couldn't be part of this cruelty, and she would not let them turn her into a weapon against a creature that only wanted to survive. And as she exhaled, she thought, "He's just as scared as I am, how could I hurt him?" Rosa felt as if the ground might swallow her whole as the stallion's nostrils flared inches from her chest. Hot breath washing over her skin, the creature towering above her, muscles quivering like cables pulled too tight. And, for a fleeting instant, she wondered if this was how her story would end, crushed beneath hooves. But something in the horse's eyes held her frozen. A flicker of understanding, as though it recognized her fear as its own, while behind her, the men's voices split into arguments, some shouting for handlers to drag her away, others screaming for blood, but Rosa blocked them out, speaking in a trembling whisper that even she barely heard, calling the stallion beautiful boy and telling him softly that she wasn't there to hurt him. And inch by inch, the stallion lowered his head, ears twitching, nostrils quivering as he drew in her scent, as if trying to decide if she could be trusted. And Rosa felt her pulse thunder with equal parts terror and hope. The crowd grew restless, stamping their feet on the wooden bleachers so hard the boards rattled under the weight, and one man tried to climb into the ring, only for a guard to shove him back, while another hurled curses that Rosa was ruining the show. Yet Rosa kept her focus on the stallion, noticing how its sides began to heave a little less violently, how its eyes blinked slowly instead of darting around in panic, and she took one careful step closer, lifting her hand until her fingertips brushed the stallion's muzzle, feeling the damp heat of his breath as the animal shivered but didn't bolt. And she swallowed a sob, because in that fragile touch was a promise that neither of them had to be monsters. The men behind her growing silent for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sight of the girl standing inches from a creature that moments earlier had seemed willing to tear the world apart. And Rosa felt something shift inside her, as if a part of her long frozen by fear had begun to thaw. Suddenly, one of the handlers appeared at the gate with a coiled whip in hand. His face twisted in fury as he shouted that the animal needed to be taught a lesson. And a surge of panic clawed up Rosa's throat because she knew that if they struck the stallion, everything she'd gained in those precious seconds would vanish in terror and pain. And she turned toward the crowd, her voice shaking but loud enough to carry as she pleaded for them to stop, her words tumbling out about how the stallion was only afraid, how beating him would only break his spirit forever. And a hush rippled through the audience, some looking uneasy, others scowling, while the man with the whip hesitated, glaring at her as though she'd committed treason. And Rosa stepped in front of the stallion, her arms spread wide like fragile wings, trembling but resolute as she declared that no one would hurt this animal while she still stood breathing, her own fear forgotten as the stallion lowered his head behind her shoulder, pressing his soft muzzle gently against her hair. At first, silence stretched across the arena like a drawn blade, broken only by the stallion's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the wooden beams. And then, incredibly, an older woman in the front row began clapping, slow and uncertain at first, until the sound grew and spread like a spark, catching dry tinder. Applause echoing off the rafters as more spectators joined in, while the man with the whip cursed under his breath and stalked away from the ring, defeated. And Rosa felt her eyes filled with tears as she turned back to the stallion, who now stood quietly at her side, his flanks still heaving but his ears flicking forward with cautious curiosity, as though he'd chosen to trust her. And in that moment, under the blazing lights, Rosa realized she wasn't just saving the horse, she was reclaiming her own courage, and when she looked up at the roaring crowd, she saw not jeers but wonder in their eyes, and, for the first time that night, hope felt real. Days after the chaos in the arena, Rosa sat on a bale of straw, in a quiet stable bathed in late afternoon sun, the scent of fresh hay and warm leather filling the air, her fingers stroking the stallion's silky mane as he drowsed beside her, his massive frame finally at ease. While outside, people gathered at the gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the horse they'd seen transformed from a raging tempest into a creature gentle enough to rest his chin on Rosa's shoulder. And, though her hands still bore faint bruises and her body ached from sleepless nights, Rosa felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't known in years. Because the debts hanging over her family's head were being erased by donations pouring in from strangers moved by her courage. And the same wealthy men who'd once demanded blood now sent messages trying to save face, offering support to the brave girl and her horse. And though Rosa felt a bitter taste whenever she thought of their hypocrisy, she knew she'd stolen something powerful from them that night, the narrative they thought they controlled. Every morning, Rosa arrived at the stable while the mist still clung to the fields, carrying buckets of grain and singing softly as the stallion pricked his ears forward, greeting her with a low rumble that vibrated in his chest, and the small routines, the gentle brushing of his coat, the soft press of his muzzle into her palm, the way he followed her steps as though tethered by an invisible thread, became sacred rituals, each moment a brick in the bridge of trust they'd built between two souls, who once knew only fear. And as word spread of Rosa's bond with the stallion, children came with wide eyes to watch. Older folks whispered that they'd never seen anything so moving. And the once violent whispers of the arena faded into stories of hope, while Rosa's mother, cheeks wet with tears, hugged her tighter every time she came home, and her little brother, growing stronger each day, insisted he wanted to meet the horse who'd saved his sister's spirit. Veterinarians and animal behavior experts began visiting Rosa's stable, offering help and marveling at how quickly the stallion recovered from the trauma, noting the way his coat regained its shine and his eyes softened whenever Rosa approached. And though some still warned that the horse might never be safe around crowds, Rosa believed the stallion deserved a life without chains or forced performances, and plans blossomed for a sanctuary where abused animals could heal, a place funded by people inspired by Rosa's story, while news crews filmed segments that aired across the country, sparking debates about cruelty in entertainment. And some of the same men who'd jeered at her in the arena now donated anonymously, trying to wash their consciences clean. But Rosa didn't care for their money, she cared for the idea that one terrified girl and one terrified horse could change how an entire town looked at compassion. One crisp morning, Rosa led the stallion into the arena where it had all begun, this time surrounded not by jeering men, but by families carrying flowers and small banners painted with words like hope and freedom. And as the stallion stepped lightly into the ring, ears flicking forward, he paused to nuzzle Rosa's cheek, sending ripples of wonder through the crowd. And Rosa felt her throat tighten as she realized they were no longer victims or spectacles, but symbols of something far bigger than either of them alone. And the mayor stepped forward to declare that the old arena would be converted into a rescue center and community gathering place, ensuring no animal person would ever again be forced to perform for cruelty's sake. And, as cheers rose like a wave around her, Rosa closed her eyes, feeling the stallion's warmth against her side, knowing that every scar and bruise had been worth it, because in saving the stallion, she had unearthed her own courage, dignity, and purpose. And, she whispered, voice trembling with conviction, he didn't just save a horse, he found himself